This is Mr. B reads J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, and we're going to start with the incredible work of The Fellowship of the Ring, arguably one of the best books ever written. This story series is aimed at our older children in years 4, 5 and 6, and we're going to enjoy listening with it to the incredible soundtrack from the films, the music of Howard Shore. So sit back and enjoy the wonderful work and music of Lord of the Rings.
J.R.R. Tolkien's The Fellowship of the Ring, Chapter 11, A Knife in the Dark. In the early night, Frodo woke from deep sleep suddenly, as if some sound or presence had disturbed him. He saw that Strider was sitting alert in his chair. His eyes gleamed in the light of the fire, which had been tended and was burning brightly, but he made no sign or movement. Frodo soon went to sleep again, but his dreams were troubled with the noise of wind and of galloping hoofs. The wind seemed to be curling around the house and shaking it, and far off he heard a horn blowing wildly. He opened his eyes and heard a cock crowing lustily in the inn yard. Strider had drawn the curtains and pushed back the shutters with a clang. The first grey light of day was in the room, and a cold air was coming through the open window. As soon as Strider had roused them all, he led the way to their bedrooms. When they saw them, they were glad they had taken his advice. The windows had been forced open and were swinging, and the curtains were flapping. The beds were tossed about, and the bolsters slashed and flung upon the floor. The brown mats were torn to pieces. Strider immediately went to fetch the landlord. Poor Mr. Butterbur looked sleepy and frightened. He had hardly closed his eyes all night, so he said, but he had never heard a sound. "Never had such a thing happen in my time," he cried, raising his hands in horror. "Guests unable to sleep in their beds, and good bolsters ruined and all. What are we going to do?" "Dark times," said Strider, "but for the present he may be left in peace once you've got rid of us. We will leave at once. Never mind about breakfast. A drink and a bite standing will have to do. We shall be packed in a few minutes." Mr. Butterbur hurried off to see the ponies were ready and to fetch them a bite, but very soon he came back in dismay. The ponies had vanished. The stable doors had all been opened in the night, and they were gone. Not only Merry's ponies, but every other horse and beast in the place. Frodo was crushed by the news. How could they hope to reach Rivendell on foot, pursued by mounted enemies? They might as well set out for the moon. Strider sat silent for a while, looking at the hobbits, as if he was weighing up their strength and courage. "Can't anything be done, Mr. Butterbur?" asked Frodo. "Can't we get a couple of ponies in the village? Or even just one for baggage? I don't suppose we could hire them, but we might be able to buy them," he added doubtfully, wondering if he could afford it. "I doubt it," said the landlord unhappily. "The 2 or 3 riding ponies that were in Bree were stabled in my yard, and they're gone. As for other animals, horses or ponies, for draft or for what, they are few and far between in Bree, and they won't be for sale. But I'll see what I can do. I'll rout out Bob and send him round as soon as may be." "Yes," said Strider reluctantly, "you had better do that. I'm afraid we shall have to try and get at least one pony at least. But so ends all hope of starting early and slipping away quietly. We might as well have blown a horn to announce our departure. That was part of their plan, no doubt." "There is one crumb of comfort," said Merry, "and more than a crumb, I hope. We can have a breakfast while we wait, and sit down. Let's get hold of Nob." In the end there was more than 3 hours' delay. Bob came back with the report that no horse or pony was to be got for love of money in the neighbourhood, except for one. Bill Fernie had one that he might possibly sell. "A poor old half-starved creature it is," said Bob, "but he won't part with it for less than thrice its worth, seeing how you're placed. Not if I knows Bill Fernie." "Bill Fernie," said Frodo. "Isn't there some trick? Wouldn't the beast bolt back to him with all our stuff, or help in tracking us or something?" "I wonder," said Strider, "but I cannot imagine any animal running home to him once it got away. I fancy this is only an afterthought of Master Fernie's, just a way of increasing his profits from the whole affair. The chief danger is that the poor beast is probably at death's door. There does not seem to be any choice. What does he want for it?" Bill Fernie's price was 12 silver pennies. That was indeed at least 3 times the pony's value in those parts. It proved to be a bony, underfed and dispirited animal, but it did not look like dying just yet. Mr. Butterbur paid for it himself. He was an honest man, and well off as things were reckoned in Bree, but still it was a sore blow to him, and being cheated by Bill Fernie made it harder to bear. After their breakfast, the hobbits had to repack and get together extra supplies for the longer journey they were now expecting. It was close on 10 o'clock before they at last got off. By that time the whole of Bree was buzzing with excitement. Frodo's vanishing trick, the appearance of the Black Horseman, the robbing of the stables, and not least the news that Strider the Ranger had joined the mysterious hobbits, made such a tale as would last for many uneventful years. Most of the inhabitants of Bree and Straddle, many even from Combe and Archet, were crowded in the road to see the travellers start. The other guests in the inn were at the doors or hanging out of the windows. Strider had changed his mind, and he decided to leave Bree by the main road, Any attempt to set off across country at once would only make matters worse. Half the inhabitants would follow them to see what they were up to and to prevent them from trespassing. They said farewell to Nob and Bob and took leave of Mr. Butterbur with many thanks. They tramped off anxious and downhearted under the eyes of the crowd. Not all the faces were friendly, nor all the words that were shouted, but Strider seemed to be held in awe by most of the Brelanders, and those that he stared at shut their mouths and drew away. He walked in front with Frodo, next came Merry and Pippin, and last came Sam leading the pony, which was laden with as much baggage as they had the heart to give it, but already it looked less dejected, as if it approved the change of its fortunes. Sam was chewing an apple thoughtfully. He had a pocket full of them, a parting present from Nob and Bob, and he was sharing them happily with the pony. At last they left the village behind. The escort of children and stragglers that had followed them got tired and turned back at the south gate. Passing through, they kept on along the road for some miles. It bent to the left, curving back into its eastward line as it rounded the feet of Bree Hill, and then it began to run swiftly downwards into wooded country. After the road had run down some way, and had left Bree Hill standing tall and brown behind, they came on a narrow track that led off towards the north. "This is where we leave the open road and take to cover," said Strider. "Not a shortcut, I hope," said Pippin. "Our last shortcut through the woods nearly ended in disaster." "Ah, but you'd not got me with you then," laughed Strider. "My cuts, short or long, don't go wrong." He took a look up and down the road. No one was in sight, and he led the way quickly down towards the wooded valley. His plan, as far as they could understand it, without knowing the country, was to head eastwards first, and then head north, across the marshes and wildlands to Weathertop Hill. In that way they would, if all went well, cut off a great loop of the road, which further on bent southwards to avoid the Midgewater marshes. But of course they would have to pass through the marshes themselves, and Strider's description of them was not encouraging. However, in the meanwhile, walking was not unpleasant. Indeed, if it had not been for the disturbing events of the night before, they would have enjoyed this part of the journey better than any up until that time. The sun was shining, clear but not too hot. The woods in the valley were still leafy and full of colour, and seemed peaceful and wholesome. Strider guided them confidently among the many crossing paths, although left to themselves they would soon have been at a loss. He was taking a wandering course with many turns and doublings back to put off any pursuit. "Bill Ferny will have watched where we left the road for certain," he said, "though I don't think he will follow us himself. He knows the land round here well enough, but he knows he is not a match for me in the woods. It is what he may tell others that I am afraid of. I don't suppose they are far away." Whether because of Strider's skill or for some other reason, they saw no sign and heard no sound of any other living thing all that day, neither two-footed, except for birds, nor four-footed, except one fox and a few squirrels. The next day they began to steer a steady course eastwards, and still all was quiet and peaceful. On the third day out from Bree, they came out of the Chetwood. The land had been falling steadily ever since they turned aside from the road, and they now entered a wide, flat expanse of country, much more difficult to manage. They were far from the borders of the Breeland, out in the pathless wilderness, and drawing near to the Midgewater marshes. The ground now became damp, and in places boggy, and here and there they came upon pools and wide stretches of reeds and rushes, filled with the warbling of little hidden birds. They had to pick their way carefully to keep both dry-footed and on their proper course. At first they made fair progress, but as they went on their passage became slower and more dangerous. The marshes were bewildering and treacherous, and there was no permanent trail, even for rangers, to find through their shifting quagmires. The flies began to torment them, and the air was full of clouds of tiny midges that crept up their sleeves and breeches and into their hair. "I'm being eaten alive," cried Pippin. "Midgewater? There are more midges than water." "What do they live on when they can't get hobbit?" asked Sam, scratching his neck miserably. They spent a horrible day in this lonely and unpleasant country. Their camping place was damp, cold and uncomfortable, and the biting insects would not let them sleep. The next day, the 4th, was little better, and the night almost as comfortless. As Frodo lay tired but unable to close his eyes, it seemed to him that far away there came a light in the eastern sky. It flashed and faded many times. It was not the dawn, for that was still some hours off. "What is the light?" he said to Strider, who had risen and was standing gazing ahead into the night. "I do not know," Strider answered. "It is too distant to make out. It is like lightning that leaps up from the hilltops." Frodo lay down again, but for a long while he could still see the white flashes, and against them the tall dark figure of Strider, standing silent and watchful. At last he passed into an uneasy sleep. They had not gone far on the 5th day when they left the last straggling pools and reed beds of the marshes behind them at last. The land before them began steadily to rise again. Away in the distance, eastward, they could now see a line of hills. The highest of them was at the right of the line, and a little separated from the others. It had a conical top, slightly flattened at the summit. "That is Weathertop," said Strider. "The old road, which we have left far away on our right, runs to the south of it, and passes not far from its foot. We might reach it by noon tomorrow if we go straight towards it. I suppose we had better do so." "What do you mean?" asked Frodo. "I mean, when we do get there, it is not certain what we shall find. It is close to the road." "But surely we were hoping to find Gandalf there, weren't we?" "Yes, but the hope is faint. If he comes this way at all, he may not pass through Bree, so he may not know where we are going. And anyway, unless by luck we arrive almost together, we shall miss one another. It will not be safe for him or for us to wait there long. If the riders fail to find us in the wilderness, they are likely to make for Weathertop themselves. It commands a wide view all round. Indeed, there are many birds and beasts in the country that could see us as we stand here from that hilltop. Not all the birds are to be trusted, and there are other spies more evil than they are. The hobbits looked anxiously at the distant hills. Sam looked up into the pale sky, fearing to see hawks or eagles hovering over them with bright and friendly eyes. "What do you advise us to do?" asked Frodo. "I think," answered Strider slowly, as if he was not quite sure. "I think the best thing is to go straight eastward from here, as we can, to make for the line of the hills, not for Weathertop. There we can strike a path I know that runs at their feet. It will bring us to Weathertop from the north and less openly. Then we shall see what we shall see." All that day they plodded along, until the cold and early evening came down. The land became drier and more barren, but mists and vapours lay behind them on the marshes. A few melancholy birds were piping and wailing until the round red sun sank slowly into the western shadows. Then an empty silence fell. The hobbits thought of the soft light of sunset glancing through the cheerful windows of Bag End far away. At the day's end they came to a stream that wandered down from the hills to lose itself in the stagnant marshland, and they went up along its banks while the light lasted. It was already night when at last they halted and made their camp under some stunted alder trees by the shores of the stream. Ahead there loomed now against the dusky sky the bleak and treeless backs of the hills. That night they set a watch, and Strider, it seemed, did not sleep at all. The moon was waxing, and in the early night hours a cold grey light lay on the land. Next morning they set out again after sunrise. There was a frost in the air and the sky was a pale clear blue. The hobbits felt refreshed, as if they had had a night of unbroken sleep. Already they were getting used to much walking on limited rations. The hills drew nearer. They made an undulating ridge, often rising almost to 1,000 feet, and here and there falling again to low clefts or passes leading into the eastern land beyond. Along the crest of the ridge the hobbits could see what looked to be the remains of green-grown walls and dikes, and in the clefts there still stood the ruins of old works of stone. By night they had reached the feet of the western slopes, and there they camped. It was the night of the 5th of October, and they were 6 days out from Bree. In the morning they found for the first time since they had left the Chetwood a track plain to see. They turned right and followed it southwards. It was already midday when they drew near the southern end of the path, and saw before them, in the pale clear light of the October sun, a grey-green bank leading up like a bridge onto the northern slope of the hill. They decided to make for the top at once, while the daylight was broad. Concealment was no longer possible, and they could only hope that no enemy or spy was observing them. Nothing was to be seen moving on the hill. If Gandalf was anywhere about, there was no sign of him. On the western flank of Weathertop they found a sheltered hollow, at the bottom of which there was a bowl-shaped dell with grassy sides. There they left Sam and Pippin with the pony and their packs and luggage. The other three went on. After half an hour's plodding climb, Strider reached the crown of the hill. Frodo and Merry followed, tired and breathless. The last slope had been steep and rocky. On the top they found, as Strider had said, a wide ring of ancient stonework now crumbling or covered with age-long grass. But in the centre was a cairn of broken stones, but they were blackened as if with fire, and about them the turf was burned to the roots, and all within the ring the grass was scorched and shriveled, as if flames had swept the hilltop, but there was no sign of any living thing. Standing upon the rim of the ruined circle, they saw all round below them a wide prospect, for the most part of lands empty and featureless, except for patches of woodland away to the south, beyond which they caught here and there the glint of distant water. Beneath them on this southern side there ran like a ribbon the old road, coming out of the west and winding up and down, until it faded behind a bridge of dark land to the east. Nothing was moving on it. Following its line eastward, with their eyes they saw the mountains. The nearer foothills were brown and sombre. Behind them stood taller shapes of grey, and behind these again were high white peaks glimmering among the clouds. "Well, here we are," said Merry, and very cheerless and uninviting it looks. There is no water and no shelter, and no sign of Gandalf, but I don't blame him for not waiting, if he ever came here. "I wonder," said Strider, looking round thoughtfully, "even if he was a day or two behind us at Bree, he could have arrived here first. He can ride very swiftly when need presses." Suddenly he stooped and looked at the stone on top of the cairn. It was flatter than the others and whiter, as if it had escaped the fire. He picked it up and examined it, turning it in his fingers. "This has been handled recently," he said. "What do you think of these marks?" On the flat underside Frodo saw some scratches. 1, 3. "There seems to be a stroke, a dot, and 3 more strokes," he said. "The stroke on the left might be a G rune with thin branches," said Strider. "It might be a sign left by Gandalf, though one cannot be sure. The scratches are fine and they certainly look fresh, but the marks might mean something quite different, and have nothing to do with us. Rangers use runes, and they come here sometimes." "What could they mean, even if Gandalf did make them?" asked Merry. I should say, answered Strider, that they stood for G3 and were a sign that Gandalf was here on October the 3rd. That is 3 days ago now. It would also show that he was in a hurry and danger was at hand, so that he had no time or did not dare to write anything longer or plainer. If that is so, we must be wary. I wish that we could feel sure that he made the marks, whatever they mean, said Frodo. It would be a great comfort to know that he was on the way, in front of us or behind us. Perhaps, said Strider. For myself, I believe that he was here and was in danger. There have been scorching flames here, and now the light that we saw 3 nights ago in the eastern sky comes back to my mind. I guess that he was attacked on this hilltop, but with what result I cannot tell. He is here no longer, and we must now look after ourselves and make our own way to Rivendell as best we can. They stood for a while silent on the hilltop near its southern edge. In that lonely place, Frodo for the first time fully realised his homelessness and danger. He wished bitterly that his fortune had left him in the quiet and beloved Shire. He stared down at the hateful road leading back westward to his home. Suddenly he was aware that 2 black specks were moving slowly along it, going westward, and looking again he saw that 3 others were creeping eastward to meet them. He gave a cry and clutched Strider's arm. "Look!" he said, pointing downwards. At once Strider flung himself on the ground behind the ruined circle, pulling Frodo down beside him. Merry threw himself alongside. "What is it?" he whispered. "I do not know, but I fear the worst," answered Strider. Slowly they crawled up to the edge of the ring again and peered through a cleft between 2 jagged stones. The light was no longer bright, for the clear morning had faded, and clouds creeping out of the east had now overtaken the sun as it began to go down. They could all see the black specks, but neither Frodo nor Merry could make out their shapes for certain. Yet something told them that there, far below, were black riders assembling on the road beyond the foot of the hill. "Yes," said Strider, whose keener sight left him in no doubt. "The enemy is here." Hastily they crept away and slipped down the north side of the hill to find their companions. Sam and Peregrine had not been idle. They had explored the small dell and the surrounding slopes. Not far away they found a spring of clear water in the hillside, and near it footprints not more than a day or 2 old. In the dell itself they found recent traces of a fire and other signs of a hasty camp. There were some fallen rocks on the edge of the dell nearest to the hill. Behind them Sam came upon a small store of firewood neatly stacked. "I wonder if old Gandalf has been in here," he said to Pippin. "Whoever it was who put this stuff here meant to come back, it seems." Strider was greatly interested in these discoveries. "I wish I had waited and explored the ground down here myself," he said, hurrying off to the spring to examine the footprints. "It is just as I feared," he said when he came back. "Sam and Pippin have trampled the soft ground, and the marks are spoilt or confused. Rangers have been here lately. It is they who left the firewood behind. But there are also several newer tracks that were not made by rangers. At least one set was made only a day or 2 ago by heavy boots. At least one, I cannot now be certain, but I think there were many booted feet." He paused and stood in anxious thought. Each of the hobbits saw in his mind a vision of the cloaked and booted riders. If the horsemen had already found the dell, the sooner Strider led them somewhere else, the better. Sam viewed the hollow with great dislike now that he had heard the news of their enemies on the road only a few miles away. "Hadn't we better clear out quick, Mr. Strider?" he asked impatiently. "It is getting late, and I don't like this hole. It makes my heart sink somehow." "Yes, we certainly must decide what to do at once," answered Strider, looking up and considering the time and the weather. "Well, Sam," he said at last, "I do not like this place either, but I cannot think of anywhere better that we could reach before nightfall. At least we are out of sight for the moment, and if we moved we should be much more likely to be seen by spies. On the north side of the road beyond the hills the country is bare and flat for miles." "Can the riders see?" asked Merry. "I mean, they seem usually to have used their noses rather than their eyes, smelling for us, if smelling is the right word, at least in the daylight. But you made us lie down flat when you saw them below, and now you talk of being seen if we move." "I was too careless on the hilltop," answered Strider. "I was very anxious to find some sign of Gandalf, but it was a mistake for 3 of us to go up and stand there for so long. For the black horses can see, and the riders can use men and other creatures as spies, as we found at Bree. They themselves do not see the world of light as we do, but our shapes cast shadows in their minds, which only the noon sun destroys, and in the dark they perceive many signs and forms that are hidden from us. Then they are most to be feared, and at all times they smell the blood of living things, desiring and hating it. We can feel their presence. It troubled our hearts as soon as we came here. They feel ours more keenly. Also," he added, and his voice sank to a whisper, "the ring draws them." "Is there no escape then?" said Frodo, looking round wildly. "If I move I shall be seen and hunted. If I stay I shall draw them to me." Strider laid his hand on his shoulder. "There is still hope," he said. "You are not alone. Let us take this wood that is already set for the fire as a sign. There is little shelter or defence here, but fire shall serve for both. Sauron can put fire to his evil uses, as he can use all things, but these riders do not love it, and fear those who wield it. Fire is our friend in the wilderness." "Maybe," muttered Sam, "it is also as good a way of saying 'here we are' as I can think of, bar shouting." Down in the lowest and most sheltered corner of the dell they lit a fire, and prepared a meal. The shades of evening began to fall and it grew cold. They were suddenly aware of great hunger, for they had not eaten anything since breakfast, but they dared not make more than a frugal supper. The lands ahead were empty of all save birds and beasts, unfriendly places deserted by all the races of the world. Rangers passed at times beyond the hills, but they were few and did not stay. "I don't see how our food can be made to last," said Frodo. "We have been careful enough in the last few days, and this supper is no feast, but we have used more than we ought." "There is food in the wild," said Strider, "berry, root and herb, and I have some skill as a hunter if needed. You need not be afraid of starving before winter comes. But gathering and catching food is long and weary work, and we need to make much haste, so tighten your belts and think with high hopes of the tables of Elrond's house in Rivendell." The cold increased as darkness came on. Peering out from the edge of the dell, they could see nothing but a grey land now vanishing quickly into shadow. The sky above them cleared again and was slowly filled with twinkling stars. Frodo and his companions huddled around the fire, wrapped in every garment and blanket they possessed, but Strider was content with a single cloak, and sat a little apart, drawing thoughtfully at his pipe. As night fell and the light of the fire began to shine out brightly, he began to tell them tales to keep their minds from fear. He knew many histories and legends of long ago, of elves and men and the good and evil deeds of the elder days. They wondered how old he was, and where he had learned all this lore. As Strider was speaking, they watched his strange, eager face dimly lit in the red glow of the wood fire. His eyes shone and his voice was rich and deep. Above them was a black, starry sky. Suddenly, a pale light appeared over the crown of Weathertop behind him. The waxing moon was climbing slowly above the hill that overshadowed them, and the stars above the hilltop faded. Strider finished another story. The hobbits moved and stretched. "Look," said Merry, "the moon is rising. It must be getting late." The others looked up. Even as they did so, they saw on the top of the hill something small and dark against the glimmer of the moonrise. It was perhaps only a large stone or jutting rock shown up by the pale light. Sam and Merry got up and walked away from the fire. Frodo and Pippin remained seated in silence. Strider was watching the moonlight on the hill intently. All seemed quiet and still, but Frodo felt a cold dread creeping over his heart. Now that Strider was no longer speaking, he huddled closer to the fire. At that moment, Sam came running back from the edge of the dell. "I don't know what it is," he said, "but I suddenly felt afraid. I daren't go outside this dell for any money. I felt that something was creeping up the slope."